The aim of the ECPR's House series is to reach beyond academia and to make the scientific work of our community known to the outside world as well. These talks are usually followed by an extended Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And for the first time for over 2 years, we have again the privilege to a speaker who delivers a live lecture at the Stein Rokkan series. Stein Rokkan, as you all know, beyond his path-breaking world in a political sociology on political cleavages, party systems and voter alignments, a subject undergoing rapid change and hence being more important today as ever, was chairman and co-founder of ECPR. This year's Stein Rokkan series speaker, Robbie Shilliam, from Hopkins University, will talk about the academic legacies of British Empire, social anthropology and international relations. Robbie Shilliam researches the political and intellectual structures of colonialism and race in the global order. Today, he will address the debate about the allegedly ever-increasing wokeism in social sciences, and I look forward to a lively debate. I would also like to invite the joint session workshop participants to a spatial chat for online networking after the lecture finishes, which you can access through the joint sessions platform. We do hope to see all the other online participants at next year's joint sessions in Toulouse, or even sooner at this year's ECPR General Conference that will be held at the University of Innsbruck. Last but not least, I would like to take the opportunity to mention ECPR's special Scholars Facing Hardship Fund, to which participants can contribute a voluntary donation. And without further ado, please welcome this year's Stein Rokkan lecturer, Robbie Shilliam. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all the people who got me here. Thanks to Matthias, Julie and Helena. Thanks to the School of Social and Political Science in Edinburgh, and to the ECPR, of course. I'm going to talk about this. Do I have to stand somewhere, or I can just freewheel? Well, we'll see. Look, I might collapse because I've got jet lag. So I'm actually trying to find some place to lean. That was my secret little thing. So I'm going to talk about this. It might not be things that you guys do, but that's cool. I'm going to give you some thoughts about it, and then we can just have a conversation. So here are some responses to the some critical responses to the campaign a little while ago by Black students and others to remove Cecil Rhodes' statue at Oriel College, Oxford. William Hutton, a principal at Oxford, notes that the academic ethos is predicated upon an open mind, freedom of debate, unobstructed access to facts, a trilogy which the campaigners tend to neglect. Anthony Lemon, esteemed geographer and South Africa specialist at Oxford, a healthy culture does not cease to remember those with whom it has come to disagree. Mary Beard, popular classicist at Cambridge, rather than a great statue Cole, the challenge, she says, is to look history in the eye and reflect on our awkward relationship to it. Effectively, these critics claim that campaigners who wanted to remove Rhodes run the risk of disavowing self-reflective and impartial inquiry, hallmarks of the academic ethos. On a broader front, the critics have equated decolonizing with vulgarizing and relativizing. Decolonizing academic inquiry makes the criteria for knowledge inclusion racial identity rather than the intrinsic worth of ideas. That's their claim. Now, crucially, this particular defense of higher education seems to associate degenerate political forces external to the academy with the intimate presence inside of what they call non-traditional students, and especially those with corresponding racialized and gendered bodies. Presently, this degeneration has garnered another name, woke culture. Tellingly, woke was a term originally developed in the Black American community, which glossed an alertness to the life and death consequences of white supremacism, not deleting Immanuel Kant from the curriculum. He's dead already. But now a bill sits in Parliament that claims to protect freedom of speech in university settings against the infiltration of wokeness. If passed, it will sit strangely besides the prevent agenda. Anyway, I'm going to disturb this defense of higher education, this particular defense, by turning to the history of the Imperial Academy. In doing so, I want to clarify how the Black presence came to be associated with a degeneration of critical faculties. But I also want to draw out the ramifications of this investigation for those of us in political science who study international politics, international relations. Now, I usually tell my undergrads that there are two IRs. There's the big letter IR, the academic study of little IR, the practice of international politics. But truth be told, big IR is a conceit. As a field that professes a disciplinary history and a theoretical canon, IR conventionally posits the anarchical state system as its formative concern. Well, we now know, or we should know, that in the US, the academic study of international relation begins as the study of imperial administration and with a concern for preserving white supremacy. But we should also be aware that similar concerns frame the academic study of IR in the UK. At issue in 1919 was not simply peace between nations, but the preservation of Britain's imperial order. So in what follows, I'm going to contribute to scholarship that's attached IR in the UK to the quandaries of imperial administration, especially those quandaries as they presented in southern Africa. Oriented in this way, I'm going to move behind the battle over Rhodes's statue to argue that historical debates over Black presence in white spaces implicate the British Academy in the empire's southern African interests. Specifically, I'm claiming that these debates problematize the cognitive competency of Black peoples to inhabit white spaces in ways that were not destabilizing of imperial order. And by white spaces, I also mean academic spaces. When it comes to British IR, maybe political science more broadly, we might wish to revisit our intellectual roots. We shouldn't be obsessed only with the classics, the history. Perhaps more salient genealogies of IR lie in the social anthropology of the interwar years and its influence upon the sociology of race relations in Britain's post-war era of Commonwealth immigration. How are we doing? Okay. Not asleep yet? All right, I am. No, I'm joking. Hello. So, the early 20th century, in an era of inter-imperial competition and after a ruinous world war, civil servants and politicians increasingly bring the empire into the mainstay of British economic planning. The 1929 Colonial Development Act provides regular funds principally for the purpose of aiding and developing agriculture and industry, and with a specific view to promoting commerce with or industry in the UK. Social anthropology is professionalized in this era, no longer a conjectural examination of ancient primitive societies. There's a methodical turn towards investigating the tribal life of contemporary natives. Let's follow this turn through the work of Bronislaw Malinowski, perhaps the most influential social anthropologist in Britain's interwar academies, the dude with the boots. Here's his challenge to his own profession. Accustomed as he is to deal with a simple mind and to understand simple cultures, Malinowski observes that the anthropologist's subject of inquiry, the native in his tribe, is irrevocably being introduced to the white man's economy and culture through colonial development. In place of the primitive and uncontaminated native of ethnographic law, Malinowski proposes a focus on the changing native. And there's a political stake attached to this focus. Malinowski argues that wherever order depends upon the upholding of tribal authority, the utility of social anthropology is to provide a sophisticated and accurate explanation of the deep-seated moral and legal force behind native sanction, which makes a law-abiding citizen out of a so-called savage. Speaking as a social anthropologist to the Colonial Development Project, Malinowski warns, "You cannot with impunity undo or subvert an old system of traditions, of morals or laws, and replace it by a ready-made new morality and sense of right. The result invariably will be what might be called black Bolshevism." Such fears are especially directed towards Southern Africa. I'm talking about the territories that have, until the mid-1920s, fallen under the administration of Rhodes's British South Africa Company, that's Southern and Northern Rhodesia, as well as Britain's Dominion of South Africa, now a Commonwealth member. Regardless of shifting and variable modes of governance, extractive industries encouraged by colonial development knit these Southern African territories and polities together into an imperial interest for Britain. Although not an expert himself on the African continent, by 1934, Malinowski has taken a keen interest in the Southern African settler colonies. From his brief travels across the region, Malinowski proposes a tripartite colonial cartography. 1, tribal reserves, 2, European districts, and then 3, the spaces in which Africans and Europeans mingle, the townships and the mining compounds. There, he suggests, a new type of human being is being produced by the impact of European civilization on archaic Africa, namely the westernized African. In Malinowski's estimation, this mutant black has evolved through a number of stages. Firstly, as the native enters a new covenant, the overwhelming superiority of European ways would compel him to renounce African values. Secondly, seeking European prestige and influence, this new African would then enter European or American university systems. Thirdly, upon return to the colony, he'd experience a color bar in white-dominated occupations and positions, a color bar that fundamentally rebuffs his aspirations to assimilate. Finally, in reaction, the native would fall back upon African beliefs and values, but in a way that hybridizes ascriptive tribal life with associational and aspirational civilized life. The result, asked Malinowski, an explosion of pan-tribal, regional, or pan-African nationalisms that are potentially destabilizing to empire. Here's the thing. Malinowski's thesis of contact and change presumes a cognitive incompetence on the part of the African native to rationally engage in white space with European forms of cooperation and sociality. Why? Charles Seligman, Malinowski's teacher, is known for his attempts to integrate psychology into social anthropology. Seligman is also convinced that the division between the conscious and unconscious is especially pervious in primitive people's psyches, leading to a far more instinctual temperament, resulting in sudden tempestuous fits of anger, suggestibility, and sexual liberty. In his earlier work on the Trobriand Islands, Malinowski has explored primitive psychology through the function of myth, a satisfaction of deep religious wants, moral cravings, social submissions, assertions, even practical requirements. Now, key here is Malinowski's assertion, taken from his teacher, that myth does not function in the primitive psyche in symbolic terms, that's what it does in the European psyche, but rather in the native psyche as a direct expression of the efficacy of its subject matter. Basically, to the primitive, myth is still alive. And so for Malinowski, a fragile wall separates the native unconscious and conscious, the id and the ego, a wall that could easily collapse under the weight of external stimuli. This is why He cannot bring himself to positively acknowledge the ability of the urbanizing African to adapt to his new urban environment. Instead, he presumes the African psyche will collapse under the pressure of racial resentment, unleashing the black reactive ego. Now, of course, Malinowski could have simply suggested that colonial administrators remove the color bar. Job done, crisis averted. He's not unsympathetic, but instead he advises a dampening of expectations. Colonial administrators, he said, should not preach to Africans that a full identity with civilization can ever be reached by them. So to be blunt, the racism of the color line is not the key issue for Malinowski. Rather, it's the cognitive incompetence of natives. That is the cause of disorder when black people come to inhabit white space. Well, Malinowski's writings come to inform another contemporaneous migration, not from the rural areas to the townships, but from the colony to the metropole. In the summer of 1940, Kenneth Little begins a research project on the black community of Cardiff's Tiger Bay. In the same year as finishing his PhD, Little undertakes his first fieldwork in Sierra Leone, where he examines urbanization of the Mende peoples through a Malinowskian frame of contact and change. It's a story that actually brings us to where we are having this conversation right now. In 1949, Little becomes lead academic for Edinburgh University's new social science research unit. At Edinburgh, Little supports and/or supervises a host of academics, including Jamaican Sidney Collins, Nigerian Ayobasi Ndem, who make key contributions to the study of Commonwealth citizens residing in Britain. What becomes clear is that these studies of black presence in white metropolitan spaces is heavily informed by social anthropology and the challenge of colonial development, which the field has sought to meet. Put another way, Little and his associates at Edinburgh critically transposed the social anthropology of colonial development into a sociology of British race relations. Let me repeat that because it's crucial. They critically transposed the social anthropology of colonial development into a sociology of British race relations. It's worth tracking this imperial transmission of academic fields through one of Little's Edinburgh scholars, Michael Banton, an incredibly influential sociologist of race relations. Anybody heard of Michael Banton? He was really big. Trust me, I don't know what else to say. If you're a sociologist, you'd know Michael Banton. I think it's true to say he was one of the big people who pushed this whole idea of racialization. Anyway, in his early 50s ethnographic fieldwork in Sierra Leone, yes, Banton did exactly what Little did, social anthropology in the metropole and the colony. Anyway, in his fieldwork, Banton had also drawn upon Malinowski's contact and change thesis. Like many of Edinburgh's scholars, Banton is concerned with how the promise of impartial social advancement in English towns is in practice moderated through an informal colour bar. Education, jobs, socialising, integration, all are adjudicated by an individual's competency to inhabit Englishness. And Englishness is a racialised mode of belonging. Crucially, Banton channels Malinowski's distrust of black cognitive competency when it comes to an orderly navigation of this colour bar, even if it's informal. Here's Banton. The slights, rebuffs and discrimination, real and imagined, which they experience may afterwards cause a reaction of resentment and may lead to a rejection of British cultural values and to political nationalism. To be fair though, Banton soon moves away from Malinowski's fear of a black ego to embrace the work of another social anthropologist, this time from the Rhodes Livingstone Institute. The institute is established in the late 1930s, a few miles out of Lusaka, the then capital of northern Rhodesia. It's the first British anthropological research unit to be situated in an African colony. It's initially set up by the governor, in part as a response to the Copperbelt strikes of 1935 and the prospect of disorderly detribalization as more and more African laborers migrate to mining towns. You get the dawn of apartheid here, right? Clyde Mitchell is an early appointee of the Institute. Mitchell is South African from a working class white family. And check this, he's convinced that migrant behavior cannot be adequately understood by Malinowski's meta-categories of native versus European and their dangerous and degenerative fusion. Mitchell's most influential piece of research undertaken at the Institute is a study of the Kalela dance, performed predominantly by migrants in the Copperbelt. In this study, Mitchell argues that those natives who come to work in the townships tend to relate to Africans outside of their own cultural and geographical contexts through wider, undifferentiated categories of belonging. In short, the urban produces a dynamic and creative social field. Black political representation utilizes situational expansive alignments. For example, it becomes the African urban tribe versus European management. Here's Mitchell. From the evidence we have at present, tribalism on the Copperbelt is still the dominant category of interaction in social fields in which Africans alone are involved. But it is not a relevant category in the field of black-white relations. Crucially for Mitchell, it's not black cognitive incompetency, but precisely the race relations sown through the color bar, which generates the problem of imperial disorder, a problem expressed in new urban affiliations. Back to Britain, late 1950s, and Banton deploys Mitchell's work. Specifically, he draws on Mitchell's suggestion that hospitality to the stranger is a customary duty that has relatively little significance for urban intertribal relations, as opposed to the significance of such a duty when it comes to allowing a stranger to permanently occupy tribal land in rural areas. From Mitchell's distinction between the relative weightiness of rural and urban affiliations in the colonial context, Banton crafts a broader abstracted rule. The category of the stranger determines social distance, but not all strangers are equal in all contexts. Some hold particular characteristics that mark their distance more than others. And it's probably fair to say that apart from, I think, my jet lag brain, Carl Mannheim, I think, is the original dude who does The Stranger, right? But Banton probably is the next most influential in terms of sociology of the stranger. And he's getting it from Mitchell, right? And the difference between urban African life and rural African life, right? So Banton abstracts this from the colonies, and he applies this as an abstract rule to British society. So in some situations, Banton explains, older racial apprehensions remain in England to imbue in the black stranger a special distance, such as black students inhabiting mixed-sex hostels. But in other situations, say in single-sex hostels, the colonial distance seems to be shrinking, he says. Banton wants to say that there is a mutability to the colour bar. Particular situations make the black body more of a disruptive stranger than in other situations. Fair enough. It allows Banton to explain the variability and so the potential transformability of race relations. But there's a cost. While Mitchell situates his stranger explicitly within a colonial field of development, Banton decontextualizes the stranger, thus leaving the colonial field behind. In short, he analogizes the Commonwealth citizen to a stranger, and he attenuates the empire to the nation, because by the time he's writing, all colonial subjects have become British citizens, right? So he analogizes the Commonwealth citizen, a citizen, to a stranger, and he attenuates the empire, the Commonwealth, to the nation. So let me put it this way. In place of Malinowski's focus on cognitive incompetency, Banton proposes a total lack of cultural competency. The figure of the stranger is one who is not only uncertain of the societal norms, he cannot read the signs. Seriously? What do you think they taught in colonial schooling? All about English culture. Well, since we're talking about education, and I said that I'd try and show how all this has implications for British IR, let me take a brief step back and to the side. Bear with me, it will all come together. Well, I'm telling you that now, but you'll be the judge. Lionel Curtis fights in the South Africa War at the turn of the century with City Imperial Volunteers, subsequently as secretary to the governor of Cape Colony, Lord Milner. Curtis is a theorist and practitioner of imperial administration. Even before the First World War, he pushes for unification of the South African colonies so as to effectively self-govern, ordered better to deal with the native question. The Royal Institute of International Affairs, colloquially known for its location at Chatham House in London. Julie, Scotland's getting its a new version, right? Anyway, the institute is initially conceived by Curtis at meeting with American counterparts during the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. It's a white supremacist, or at least Anglo-Saxon supremacist initiative. Over the next 2 decades, key figures in Chatham House encouraged the establishment of affiliated institutions of international affairs in the British dominions, such that by the 1930s, the Institute is increasingly perceiving the problem of imperial administration as a problem of Commonwealth administration. If you do IR, you might have heard of this guy, Charles Manning, South African born, Oxford educated, formative influence on what they call the English school, mentor to Martin White, Hedley Bull, and ultimately an apologist for apartheid. Anyway, Manning attends the preparatory committee of the first British Commonwealth Relations Conference in Toronto, 1933, and he's the one who there proposes the formation of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Now, as South Africa formally begins its apartheid regime, the Dominion's racist events of self-governance comes increasingly at odds with the aims of Commonwealth administration. Although it only gets fully articulated in Harold Macmillan's Winds of Change speech in Cape Town, 1960s, the problem is already germane. Britain is concerned with managing the transition to self-government in its non-white colonies. Yet, the South African Dominion is fundamentally at odds with black self-governance, principally and politically. Such concerns make colonial administration necessarily an exercise in race relations. And you might now start to see how the stakes at play when social anthropologists such as Clyde Mitchell seek to frame colonial development as a politics of race relations. Anyway, these concerns ultimately lead Harry Hodgson, a collaborator of Chatham House and a distinguished colonial administrator himself, to suggest at the Commonwealth Relations Conference in 1949 and then at Chatham House in 1950, to suggest the formation of an Institute of Race Relations. Of communism and race relations, argues Harry, it's the latter that is of more importance to the Cold War era. Not communism. Race relations, he says, is more important. Here he is waxing lyrical. If communism succeeded in enlisting most of the discontented of the non-European races on its side, so that the frontier between democracy and its enemies was a racial as well as an ideological and political frontier, then that danger would be greatly multiplied, and the chance of our eventually coming out on top would be so much the poorer. To the extent that we solve the racial problem itself, we shall of course be preventing that combination from coming out. Of British Empire, Hodgson suggests that we are in the cocoon stage, and who can tell what moth or butterfly will hatch. The Commonwealth idea he moots is fundamentally the idea of political equality. But this idea is confronted with the race problem, which spans the international and the intra-imperial, meaning dominions, colonies, and metropole. Here, hence, according to Hodgson, international politics is to be found wherever there is a racial or colour minority, from the West Indies to the West India docks. Theoretical presumptions of domestic and international distinctions never work too well in an imperial world. I would submit that the Institute of Race Relations, inaugurated in 1958, is as much an intellectual site of British IR as is Chatham House. Okay, so now to step forward again and towards the academy at large. In the interwar and wartime period, the race problem in Britain is considered mostly in terms of what they call half-caste children in dockside cities or in towns near the barracks of African American troops. Post-war, the perceived location of the problem shifts to Oxbridge campuses. At the time that Hodgson is giving his warnings and the Institute of Race Relations is being scoped out, civil servants and politicians in Britain begin to worry that resentment of the informal colour bar by resident black students might impact badly upon the integrity of the Commonwealth. These students, after all, are potential leaders of independent states. And this post-imperial order, a very English school one, a society of Commonwealth states, it needs to be nurtured. Put it this way, for a moment in time, some of the key protagonists in British international relations are not other states or statesmen, but black students at Oxbridge. Lo and behold, echoing Malinowski and the early Banton, there's a distrust of the cognitive competency of these students. For instance, the Colonial Office warns in 1948 that such Commonwealth students are vulnerable to communist propaganda due to the lack of corrective home and social influence, something which induces discernment in English students but is absent in Commonwealth ones. Commonwealth students are even considered by some to be harbingers of black revenge. Take Dame Marguerite Perham, a mentor to Martin White, a writer on native administration on the continent, BBC broadcaster, interwar and post-war lecturer and fellow at Oxford. She warns, in Malinowskian logic, that the psyches of African students in Britain are warped by the promise of the supreme racial compensation, sleeping with white women. Anyway, data gathered by the recently formed Institute of Race Relations testifies to the experience of Commonwealth students at Oxbridge. Jamaican Rhodes Scholar Mervyn Morris, attending St Edmund Hall, complains of his white peers constantly being surprised. You speak English very well. Patricia Madu, a Trinidadian taking modern history at St Anne's College, recounts the same. How long have you been speaking English? Sheila Kitzinger, one of Kenneth Little's famous pregnancy experts, Sheila Kitzinger. Anyway, at that time, one of Kenneth Little's Edinburgh collective of social anthropologists, Kitzinger also researches black Commonwealth students at Oxbridge. They mentioned to her the difficulties in constructing friendships with white peers. They speak to you very nicely, but all the time they seem to be thinking, I wonder whether he can read. Most importantly, Kitzinger's informants report that the relationship would break down when the white partner becomes embarrassed by the Negro's self-consciousness. Embarrassed by the Negro's self-consciousness. Stuart Hall, the premier British intellectual of the 20th century, not the one who does It's a Knockout, but the real one. That's an age joke, by the way. Anyway. He enters the academy in 1951 as a Jamaican youth to read an undergraduate degree in English at Merton College, Oxford. This is his reflection. I was conscious all the time that I was very, very different because of my race and colour, and in the discourses of Englishness, race and colour remained unspeakable silences. So I'm trying to say then that between Malinowski's fear of a cognitive incompetency and Banton's ascription of cultural incompetency, black Commonwealth students in the British Academy could never simply exist as innocent students or intellectuals. They are potential purveyors of anarchy, future destroyers of the comity of Commonwealth nations. But here's the thing I really want to impress upon you. It's easy for us to criticise Malinowski and Banton for their colonial logics. It's harder for us to accept that Negro self-consciousness might itself have explanatory power. Cue John Rex. Born as Clyde Mitchell had been to a South African white working class family. There's a real interesting and important history about white working class South African anthropologists and sociologists, by the way, in the way in which they really shaped the post-war field. Anyway, Rex graduates from Rhodes University and after a brief spell in southern Rhodesia, arrives in the UK in 1948 to teach in the extramural department of Hull University. Rex's first academic publication in 1954 discusses the increasing threat of apartheid to South African universities. In it, he takes issue with the growing trend of student segregation, a phenomenon that directly affects his alma mater and to which he resisted as a student. Rex warns that political segregation has academic implications, especially in terms of the racist funneling of black and white students into practical and intellectual subjects, respectively. Now, for our purposes, what's interesting is that Rex subsequently frames these issues through a critique of Malinowski. True, he acknowledges the utility of Malinowski's contact thesis and its delineation of a new native emerging in the urban intersection of the African and European. But he's critical, just like Mitchell, of Malinowski's attribution of a cognitive incompetence to the new native as he struggles with change. In fact, Rex points out that in Malinowski's model, there is no determining roles for native intentions or interests, because while European culture enjoys a directive role, natives simply react. And if that's the premise, argues Rex, then the intellectual input from African institutions is null and void when it comes to European policy. In other words, when contact and change is mediated by a colour line, there can be no resulting consensus. Rather, consensus is an ideological mask worn by the empirically dominant group as it seeks to preserve its dominion. That's exactly how Rex apprehends race relations in post-war Britain. He dismisses Banton's figure of the abstracted stranger and other sanitized ideas of culture shock, and against arguments that rely upon a consensus position framed by the dominant force in a relationship, Rex defines race relations as a situation of abnormally harsh exploitation, coercion, or competition. Check out Rex's description of the Malinowskian zone of transition in 1960s multicultural Birmingham. A life of squalor, of underprivilege and of conflict, a world far from the functionally integrated social systems which sociologists are too fond of discussing. Overall, then, Rex charges social anthropology with failing to sufficiently address the structurally conflicted nature of imperial order, including and especially at the level of knowledge production. The inclusion of a knowledge dimension betrays the abiding influence of Rex's biography, specifically his earlier opposition to apartheid in South Africa's higher education system. Well, by the late 1960s, British higher education is no longer conceived by sociologists to be the principal space wherein a destabilising black Commonwealth presence attains. That presence is now to be found in the inner cities amongst the British-born or raised youth of immigrants. Yet still, Rex continues to be concerned with the complicity of the academy in the defence of white dominion in a post-imperial order. In 1974, Bhikkhu Parekh, remember him from Labour, New Labour? He surveys a number of non-white intellectuals, including famous Trinidadian C.L.R. James, on their residence in England and the nature of Englishness. Rex responds, he's interviewed, to Parekh's intervention by questioning any celebration of the fact that black intellectuals may be employed in key administrative positions in British... God, when I was reading that sentence, I was thinking about the Conservative Party. Anyway. The more important question, Rex argues, is whether the job requires that... Now I'm really thinking about it. The more important question, Rex argues, is whether the job requires the intellectual to undertake work that supports or excuses the problem of racism. He turns his attention back to the academy, pointing out that racist theories are increasingly being normalized and that academics are less and less predisposed towards anti-racism. That sounds familiar too. Anyway, what is needed, implores Rex, is some research into the research process as an instrument of racism. However, within a few years, Rex himself is attracting criticism from black scholars, many of whom are affiliated to Stuart Hall's Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. Valerie Amos, recently director of SOAS, Paul Gilroy, you heard of him, and Errol Lawrence write an especially pertinent critique of what they call white sociology. And I want to dwell on one aspect of their critique, which is this. Despite Rex's argument that consensus politics requires the assumption that natives simply react and don't think, despite this, Rex's own sociology of race relations never considers the explanatory value of black thought for sociological analysis itself. For instance, Amos, Gilroy and Lawrence highlight Rex's depiction of Rastafari in Birmingham as a movement that he defines as political alienation from British society. They question why Rex could not consider Rastafari on its own cognitive terms, not as an alienation from, but as a confrontation with Britain's white supremacism. You are alienated, but you confront. The latter requires conscious, directive agency. Let's recall here Kitzinger's earlier study, Commonwealth students at Oxbridge, and the way in which white peers were embarrassed by evidence of black self-consciousness. Well, black self-consciousness remains as enigmatic in Rex's analysis as it had been coloured primitive in Malinowski's. And while Banton abstracts the black presence from its imperial entanglements, Rex makes absent the consciousness which accompanies the black presence as it settles in Britain. Alternatively, take Stuart Hall. He tends to describe himself not as a reactive ego or not as an incompetent stranger, but as, in his words, a familiar stranger. A familiar stranger. Now, this description is really instructive for another kind of British IR. The self-consciousness of being a familiar stranger is precisely a critique of imperial administration and its torturous and contradictory settlements into a post-imperial global order. The trope of familiar stranger invokes the already existing complicity of empire in making political, economic, cultural, and cognitive segregations. So let me finish by tracing some other intellectual traditions that we, those of us in IR at least, might want to consider as much as texts such as Manning, Martin White, and Hedley Bull. I'm talking about black traditions of thought that by necessity try to scope out a communitas of familiar strangers. Here lies another tradition of political science. First thing to acknowledge is that an academic tradition of black thought on racism, citizenship and empire never galvanized in Britain, not an academic tradition, until perhaps very recently. This, despite the longevity of the academic careers of people like Gus Johns, Susan Scarth, Harry Goldborn, Malcolm Cumberbatch and others. Not all of them London, by the way. To me, that's a given, considering the deeply seated suspicion of black cognitive and cultural competency that took hold in academic spaces as much as any other white space. No surprise then that so many black scholars walk the line between community organising and university teaching. Take, for instance, Devon Thomas, employed by Goldsmith College's Sociology and Anthropology Department in 1975, pre-Gilroy, working especially in the community, Gilroy started at Goldsmith, working especially in the community studies section, and 6 years later, a member of the Brixton Defence Campaign assembled after the 1981 uprisings. Take also black journals, which again existed on the edge of academia, never endorsed by or run within academia. Now, in 1959, Michael Banton provided the first article for the Institute of Race Relations journal, imaginatively titled Race. By the early 1970s, the context was increasingly shaped by black power, anti-apartheid, third world liberation struggles, Ambalavana Sivanandan leads a palace coup at the Institute of Race Relations, which eventuates in a much poorer but much more autonomous institution, and the revamping of its journal into an explicitly anti-imperial digest, Race and Class. By the way, from that you get Cedric Robinson come in, you get what we now know as racial capitalism via South Africa. Another breakaway group from the IRR, comprising Darcus Howe, Farrokh Dondi and Linton Kwesi Johnson, published Race Today, the journal's tagline, "Voice of the Black Community in Britain." That signalled its independence from academic ownership. Now, for sure, black tradition of thought on familiar strangers coalesced most intensely in community-based institutions and initiatives. There, black education on empire and its legacies were galvanized alongside and autonomous to the work of Stuart Hall, Sivanandan and others. From the early 1970s, countless reasoning circles of Rastafari sharpened analyses of racism, colonialism and black redemption. These were also, on occasion, political spaces. The United Black People's Improvement Organisation even had its supporters in the House of Lords. The Fasimba circles, Fasimba after the name of Shaka Zulu's own regiment, they undertook cognate reasoning along with a host of politically active groups with a global remit such as Black Unity and Freedom Party, Black Panther Movement and Black Liberation Front. Additionally, we might want to think of Len Garrison's work in black community education, a contemporary of Rex, but unlike Rex, Len wrote the first text on Rastafari to take the movement's claims and arguments seriously on its own terms. Len, with others, opened the Black Cultural Archives in 1981, and now it enjoys its own building and exhibition space in Windrush Square. Indeed, the work of black intellectuals has often been focused on building institutional capacities that do not depend on the academy. John LaRose and Jessica Huntley became co-directors of the International Book Fairs of Radical Black and Third World Books, which ran from 1982 to 1985, 13 years. LaRose also run New Beacon Books, the Huntleys Bogle Overture Press. So to conclude with a plea, don't just fix your gaze on the people protesting in front of Rhodes' statue as if that vista is adequate. There's far more behind the statue that implicates the British Academy in empire's southern African interest. For most of the 20th century, social anthropologists and sociologists struggled, theoretically, ethically and politically, over the attribution of a destabilizing nature to black presence, especially in terms of a cognitive and cultural incompetence to accommodate change peacefully and reasonably. At one point, that political struggle was had even within the gates of Oxford's colleges and other academic institutions, here too. In any case, that struggle was never intellectually resolved within the academy. Now, the UK government issued the Swan Report in 1985, dealing with secondary education. And that finally, in 1985, categorically ruled out eugenic claims that black children had lower IQ. Higher education, where we are, has never had a Swan Report. And just think of that, given the history I'm giving you. In any case, that struggle was never intellectually resolved within the academy, and now after decades and generations of settlement, Black students exist in this academy primarily as domestic students, with those defined as Black African being one of the largest ethnic groups of the total BME student population. So in response to the dons of Oxford and Cambridge and their supporters who criticise Rhodes and other decolonising campaigns full of wokeness, I guess I'd say this. These campaigns do not so much introduce a vulgar identity politics into the academy. There's another bunch of people who are doing that. As much as force us to recall the academy's complicity in race and empire. These campaigns compel us to retrieve Black traditions of thought on empire and its afterlives, on a communitas of familiar strangers. As our world changes from post-imperial to post-Commonwealth, post-EU, might we want to consult the intellectual traditions of those who have long inhabited such changes? Might this intellectual task be actually an imperative of our craft as political scientists? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Shilliam, for this wonderful, incredibly insightful and provocative lecture. My name is Matthias Thaler. I'm part of the local organizing team. And together with my colleague Ben Martil, I will field the questions for Professor Shilliam. We will have both online questions and in-person questions, but we want to start with the room here. Please do raise your hand if you have a question, but do wait, please, for the microphone, because otherwise people listening in and looking at the lecture from the outside can't hear you. So who wants to kick us off with a question for Professor Shilliam?
Thank you for, it's on? Yeah. Thank you for this talk. It's fascinating. I was trying to quickly type some of the more compelling sentences that I wanted to chew on, you know. So my question is basically, we were covering British IR, but British IR is probably not happening in a vacuum. What role is American IR, or I don't know, broadly European IR is playing in these dialogues? Or, you know, are they running in similar trends, or expound on this a bit more? It'd be interesting.
Whoo!
Another hour, right?
Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah. I mean, I could give you one little thing from it. At the same time as British, at the same time as social anthropology in Britain is turning to a sociology of race relations, right? And why that's important is because it blurs the international and domestic distinction, and it even blurs the comparative distinction, right? This is a movement of migration within empire from rural to urban, and then the same understanding of that disorderly nature is then transposed onto moving from colony to city metropole, right? I'm saying that because straight away what we don't have here is a state. Okay, we have a commonwealth, right? At the same time as that's happening, a similar debate is taking place in the US, and that debate is taking place about the migration north of African Americans, you know, in the decades before, and then the question of the Negro problem in urban areas, right? And in fact, people like Robert Park and Franklin Frazier, famous urban sociologists in the US, they have dealings with Malinowski, but there's also an autonomous kind of route to their thought as well, but they certainly have dealings with the social anthropologists. The important thing is they make almost exactly the same argument about the destabilizing effect, right, Yeah. So you've got migration of peoples into places they shouldn't be in, holding proximities they should never have, as the foundational problem of politics. If you go back to the beginning of political science as a formal discipline, late 1800s at my university, Hopkins, Columbia, a bit later Chicago, you find almost exactly the same problem, which actually produces the behavioral tradition, right? And that problem is, well, you know, we had this Declaration of Independence and we all loved John Locke, and we could, you know, hold each other to, you know, sign pithy little social contracts in our head and trust each other to obey those rules. But we were all Anglo-Saxon, white, propertied men. Now, what's happening now? We've got black emancipation. We've got Mexicans coming over the border with the trade unions. We've got Irish Catholics. We've got Italians. We've got East Europeans. All these people coming in, they're citizens. Can you trust them? Can you trust their competencies? No, you can't. So what we need instead of a social contract is a community of power. A community of power that can defend and preserve the institutions of democracy from their degradation by citizens who don't have the competency to know their own interests and act according to a harmony of interests. It's a problem of political behavior, public opinion, Woodrow Wilson, Charles Merriam, all them dudes. By the time that the sociologists and the social anthropologists in the US and in the UK are talking about movement of peoples post-war, the social science, what is it, man? The comparative politics group is set up to basically scale up the racist examination of political behavior in the US to figure out what the political behavior of all these crazy, newly independent, decolonizing countries are. And most important in all that is, can we trust their leaders? Are their leaders too caught between tradition and modernity? The whole Weberian thing. You know, can we really trust them to come onto our side in a way which doesn't actually blow up the whole world? They'll go to communism, we'll have a next world war. Remember when I said this is exactly the same time that people like Stuart Hall are coming into Oxford. So I'm just giving you that in terms of a different, a slightly different kind of framework to understand some of the basic foundational problems that political science has set itself, with IR as one of them, right? And which if we don't look at these things, we would imagine weren't there. Now you come back to the present and you tell me how far away any of that is now.
There's a question there.
Thanks for that. And actually, my question sort of follows directly on your last comment about bringing the story up to the present. Because in an interesting way, right, by talking about these two different disciplinary backgrounds of social anthropology and international relations in the mid-century era, I'm hearing that as sort of an account of the pathologies of that kind of cross-disciplinary, whatever you call it, fertilization or whatever. But it seems to me that there's a lot less of that today, of that, not the pathology, but the sort of influence across disciplines of these understandings. And so what I'm hearing is, you know, part of your story of, you know, where we're at today with the campaign with Rhodes and so forth is an inheritance of that past. But I'm wondering whether you see those same kind of, I mean, because anthropology and sociology look very different today, right? And so in a sense, it's the lack of communication between those disciplines that may be more troubling in 2022 than the influence of those today, I'm thinking. Anyways, I'm just wondering if you can bring that story up to the present, and if there's more silos, and if so, where that kind of the stories that you started with are they just informed by entrenched power or by new disciplinary formations and something like that?
Yeah, no, thanks for that.
Yeah.
So I'll try and give a little. I'll try. One of the things that I think is important is to recognise that the fields develop and are in interrelation with each other, not only, but significantly through the problem of empire, right, and inter-imperial conflict and relations, right? And so a lot of what I was just talking about wouldn't make sense if you were just looking at kind of states, right, or, you know, state and society, citizen and government, all that kind of stuff, right? If we push that forward, then I think actually we suffer from something that happened. I would say, well, it kind of happens in bits and starts from the 50s right through to the 80s, I would say, which is slowly and slowly the obfuscating or eviscerating of empire as a field of study, a scale of study, right, from the disciplines. Paradoxically, the one discipline which decolonized the most, anthropology, in part did so because it couldn't access its sites anymore. When places went independent, you had to ask. You couldn't just go in anymore, right? And one of the interesting things is that anthropology has, not all, but I'm just saying there's one trend in anthropology, which is to shine the light back onto Western institutions, right? But that shining the light back on Western institutions, the question then is posed about whether they lose the imperial, right? Now, if you think about political science, after the Shoah, there are good reasons why they stopped being eugenicists, right? But what the comparativists did is they basically made it at the level of epistemology that you couldn't see empire. All you saw was states. That as the fundamental comparative unit, and states were defined by political independence and a harmony of interest. The harmony thing went, but nonetheless the idea of politically independent units remained, right? So even with something like comparative, you've got the illusion of the importance of empire for the very reason why the field actually, subfield develops in the first place. Same with IR from the 80s. I would say from the 80s, after the kind of eclipse of black power, the push to area studies of all the stuff of racism that IR did, that all fell out of IR, and you got this abstract stuff like you do in a lot of political science about, you know, interests and you know, like people do IR, neoliberalism, neo-institutionalism, all that kind of stuff, right? And in sociology too, you have this attenuation. Like social anthropology was the go-to method in sociology until mid-60s, something like that, right? So I'm not saying that things haven't changed. They have changed. Decolonization happened and it was a big thing, right? But the connections that I was talking about connect the centers and the peripheries, the colonies and the metropoles, before that independence, and they retain them as well now, right? Can we understand the far right unless we understand it transnationally? You know that guy Dylan, what's his name, Roof, who killed those people in the American South a few years ago. I don't know if you remember that guy. You know what he's wearing his badge? Was the independence badge of Rhodesia, Ian Smith's independence badge, Rhodesia, right? The last white hope was to retain Rhodesia, not turn it over to the blacks like Harold Wilson or whatever it was. No, was it Harold Wilson? Whoever was in government at the time wanted to do, right? They saw that as absolutely not just analogous, but interconnected to desegregation of the South. Now today, in our political science, and let me take it to the prevent agenda, because a lot of the people who are all on wokeness and about freedom of inquiry in university seem to say nothing about the prevent agenda, which is the biggest piece of an instrument of state power and control over higher education, explicitly designed, right, to attenuate the freedom of speech of particular students in university, Muslim students. But that doesn't seem to be an issue for wokeness. Do you get what I'm saying? Now, in IR, for example, why I made the pithy argument that the institution of race relations is as much British IR as Chatham House, right, is because anybody who knows anything about Prevent will tell you that you can't understand that domestically. So why aren't IR scholars do? I mean, there's some like Amal Abu Bakari, and there's some others who do it. But why is Prevent seen as like a social policy issue and not a political science issue? If we're thinking about wokeness, I just get rid of Prevent. I mean, I'm serious. I really don't understand. Get rid of Prevent. But that's not a domestic issue. It's got all legacies and afterlives of empire in it. It's constantly just sedimenting upon each other. But wokeness is a nice, easy thing to say. It's a nice, easy thing to say, you know, let's preserve the great tradition. But one of the things I was trying to say, this tradition is shot through with imperial power, right? And above all, and I was trying to be kind to it. I'm going off track now, I'll stop. I was trying to be kind to it. If, like, you know, John Rex, he really tried to do some stuff. Michael Banton tried to change his mind. Malinowski's lost hope, but that's just Malinowski. But you know what I mean? I was trying to show that these people were struggling to figure something out, even if they didn't quite figure it out. But now, when we give the British Academy a free pass, as if we are preserving it for impartial inquiry, what we're doing is making it unfit for purpose. It never had its Swan report. I just think about that, right? You know that kids, like, you know, South Asian and black kids, right, were being told, that their parents were being told that they're educationally subnormal. And that teachers would use that as reasons to exclude them, mark them down, expel them, whatever. And the Thatcher government thought that it was significant an issue for the integrity of the polity that they actually did that Swan report. And they actually said eugenics is bullshit. Now, that was 40 years after the end of the Second World War, but better late than never. Tell me what higher education has ever done to think through its complicities and afterlives of empire. What has it ever done in a systematic fashion? You know, like University of Zimbabwe, University of West Indies, all these universities across the world were all once, from the 40s onwards, there were university colleges of London. Right, you know, you have the University of London. So they were like LSE, Queen Mary, King's. They were university colleges, right? You know, they sent the scripts back and forwards. This was an imperial academy, right? In Jamaica, in the Mona campus, University of West Indies, it used to be called University College of West Indies, because it's a college of University of London. People abbreviated it to UC, you know, University College West Indies. Rastafari abbreviated it to U Blind. So where is that? That's all I'm saying. It's not there. So now people come in with wokeness and they haven't done their work. I mean, I'm talking about professional obligations and professional standards. I'm not even talking about ethics or morality. Do you get what I'm saying? School teachers would have to, you would hope that after the Swan report in 1985, a whole new generation of school teachers would be trained not to be eugenicists. where do we do that in higher education?
Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed the talk. I was just wondering if you think a reformed university is possible in theory and then in a more practical sense as well.
What do you think?
What do I think you think? Or
What do you think you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of skeptical myself, especially in practice, and especially with global politics right now. Sometimes I feel like what we do, like, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, of course it's important to try to make change, et cetera, but I wonder if we're reforming and improving a system, and in that sense, building in resilience to empire, as you say.
I wonder what other people think about that.
So I had a question, just like what she said. Those of us who are from the empire and sort of teaching in British academic universities, do you think we are more complicit into enhancing those legacies, or do you think our participation is more like emancipatory in the way that, I don't know, probably because we fit into a predetermined curriculum, we're supposed to teach it. So I'm not sure if you think we're sort of enhancing those legacies, or do you think it's sort of a starting point, or rather this chain reaction of sort of emancipating sort of the curriculum? And yeah, I don't know what your thought would be. That, to be honest, I have no answer to. If you ask me what I think,
I was just going to do that. No, but tell me something. Tell me something. Tell me something about what you think with that.
Oh, goodness. I mean, there's two ways to look at it, right? In some sense, there is a degree of sort of liberation in a way, or emancipation in a way, but again, to some extent, you do feel you belong in a system that already has all these predetermined rules. And obviously, you sort of a single individual within this massive scale, and it's quite, sort of, you find like you only have to go through the rigors of, just doing your bit. Teaching and marking scripts and doing all kind of stuff. And the other fundamental issues of race and stuff, you sort of ignore it because, well, you found it there, surely there's not much you can do about it. But anyway, I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Nandini, what do you think about all that, man? You knew I was going to ask you, man. So she's one of our grad students from Hopkins, and she turned up, so she's got to pay. I know, because I know you think about this stuff.
Yeah, this was actually, I wrote a comprehensive exam for Robbie, and this was, I think, my last line of, I don't know what to do, I'm in. Are you asking me for answers?
Or thoughts, if
well,
not answers.
I mean, it is something I think many of us struggle with because as at least right now from my position as a graduate student, what I really want to do is impress everybody so that I can get a job.
For sure.
And that's, I think, so if for that, and we've been having conversations about this in seminars in our department as well, of if that's the case and that's what, emerging scholars need to do, then what happens is you have to speak to, you have to stick to the script, right? You have to do a lit review, you have to talk about all these literatures that may not be relevant necessarily, but you have to do it because that's what they tell you to do. You have to cite people because they're in the canon, even if it doesn't, it's not practically relevant. So I think there's, I think the calling of the profession is very different from the calling of our political commitments. And I think that really comes up, that like a clash is set up, I think, that is very hard to, hard to overcome. So I share the concerns of, I like personally think about, am I betraying, like my not only my own commitments, but like my whole community, which is too much of a burden to take. So, but yeah, you do think about like, well, if you're part of the system, then you're complicit. And if you have to stay on in the system, you have to prolong that complicity. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Were you going to add on? Sorry, Matthias, I'm taking it away from you.
Okay, I don't want to take anything away of what has been said. I'm a feminist scholar myself, and we always have this idea that the world is gendered, so political science is gendered too, and I think you could draw in that respect a huge parallel to everything that has been said. And I was also wondering about this, what's next? And I think that sometimes I'm getting very nervous when I see how things evolve. And I think, for instance, but there's also, for me, there's one little thing which I think is which might be positive, and that is that the last couple of decades, political science in general has tried to become a real science, and it became very technocratic, okay? So the whole idea of ideas and norms was always put away to normative political theory. So it was not simply political theory, it was normative political theory, somewhere very far in a corner. And I think that the last couple of years, with part of the methodologies that came up, more constructivist thinking, interpretative methods, I have the impression that positioning yourself and norms, the doors to that is opened again, And this is something where I think where we could find a way to move things forward, okay? It's not everything, but it might help in a way or another.
No, thank you for that. Thank you. Just to add something onto that conversation, part of the argument, so there's an intergenerational and a hierarchy thing here, which I'll address because it's crucial, right? But just before that, we can think of this as an issue of ethics and an issue of politics, and it always is in some way, shape, or form. But I would rather just think of it immediately in terms of intellectual acuity. That's all, right? Do we have the tools needed to explain the world as it is? So, in the 6th of January insurrection on the Capitol, in DC a couple of years ago, remember that one, right? And then APSA issued a statement shortly afterwards. Did anybody see the first statement? Yes. Yeah, it was bullshit. I'm sorry to swear. It was rubbish. It was like, don't use violence. There's good people on either side. Let's chill out. I mean, it was reprehensible, right? They issued a statement a few days later and said, we really got it wrong. We're really sorry. And what we need to do is learn more from the feminists and black study scholars in political science about this. So put it another way, American politics rests on the premise that America is a democracy, right? But it has some kind of functional integration, as ropey as that might be, right, which leads to a separation of interests which then compete in some kind of functioning way, in some kind of way, right? And that it's not authoritarian, right? I mean, that's a concept for the comparativists. They study democracy, authoritarianism, and all that, right? Violence doesn't inhere in the political institutions themselves. You know, you can go to the ghetto and think about that and be a sociologist, right? Or you can go to Africa and think about that and be an Africanist. But here they were faced with a violent and racist, misogynistic takeover of one of the key institutions of government, right? Backed by an authoritarian grab. And they had no vocabulary by which they could address that. They had to admit it. So rewind all the ethics and all that. Do we have the tools we need to examine and explain the world as it is now? That's it. That's all. No, we don't, right? We do, but not from where people are looking. And then that comes to the hierarchy question. Because then what you do your comprehensive exams, you do your PhD work, you learn certain methods, and methods aren't good or evil, don't get me wrong, I'm fine with any method, I honestly am, right? That's not the issue to me, right? But then the methods drive the writing instead of the question driving the method, right? So you've got this whole edifice here, which is totally hierarchicalized, profs in comfortable positions, tenured, like me, you know, in control of particular journals, particular funds, particular conferences, right? They reproduce something which can't explain the world as it is. Now, younger scholars, surprise, surprise, with the world in front of them, are more likely to think, this doesn't explain. So it behoves senior scholars, scholars with resources and scholars with standing and with safety, to actually take the plunge and do some of this work. And it doesn't mean to say change your research agenda. It means could you put in a graduate class on racism, or a graduate class on transphobia, right? Or a graduate class on climate change. Could you put that in and have your students take it with an eye to thinking that maybe they'll do a dissertation on it? Would you be okay with that? Do you get what I mean? And that's it. That's an intergenerational thing. So it's not on Nandini and these. It's not on them. It's not on them. You know.
We have a question from online, which I'll just relay. So from Shubha Prasad. And they say the complicity of academia in perpetuating inequality exists still today. They give the examples of being told you speak English very well, of not being at the venue because their UK visa could not be processed in time, and of being discouraged to research certain topics because they're not considered mainstream enough. And then they ask, how do we break these patterns in studying IR from a position of disadvantage?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Shiva. I'm not answering it because it's a question to resonate, right?
So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, first here and then here again.
Thank you so much for your talk. I learned so much. I just have a question about whether in your project you're looking also at the multidirectionality of these patterns of understanding political science and doing IR. Because what happens with the institutionalization of these worldviews in the discipline, they travel beyond the former Commonwealth. And I'm thinking here what happened in the 90s after the fall of the Iron Curtain, is that you have UK, but also US and a lot of institutions from the Anglo-Saxon political science establishment establishing research institutes, pumping money into Eastern European countries and implementing a model of doing IR and doing political science that brings with it all the erasures that you have brought with you, right? And implements and institutionalizes a model of scientificity that is problematic in all the ways that you have described. And I was wondering if you're looking also how this travel beyond the obvious geographical scope of what you're looking at. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. But it sounds like you've done that. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about what you've done?
Well, I mean, I can speak until tomorrow morning, but like there was a system of so-called invisible colleges that were financed by the US Embassy, and they were basically sending a lot of political scientists, IR theorists, in order to finally establish political science in the wake of what was considered to have been an exclusively, you know, materialist framework of doing IR and political science. Yeah.
So maybe the last two questions, can I ask you two to raise your questions, and Robbie responds if he wants to, and then I'm closing.
Yeah, so I suppose a concern I would have about, you know, the current British government in their kind of culture war, or their war on, you know, academia being too left-wing and woke as they perceive it, is that they might actually try, or are trying to make it more exclusionary financially by raising tuition fees and kind of roll back the people who kind of want to run the courses you were talking about on rights or decolonise, will kind of they'll exclude that next generation by financially, basically.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just very quickly on that. I know there's another question, but very quickly on that. Yeah, I think I think there's a class analysis here to the extent that not all, but the majority of the kind of decolonising, Rose must fall kind of movements have been in Russell Group universities in the UK, and far less often in the, what's the other groups? Millennium, in the post-92s and all that. Not all, but mainly. And I think what, with the whole pension dispute, you know, is part of a longer process of using all these levers to get rid of universities as a public institute. So you know, John Homewood and Gurminder Bamber have done a lot of work on this, right? To get rid of it as a public field and to privatise it simply so as to ensure that those universities which are elite now, by and large, will survive, and those which aren't will fall down back into the polytechs or just become business parks, right? But those ones which are well off, their children will be able to have that experience, and their children will be doing decolonising, this, that and the other. But it will be an elite affair. And it won't be linked to any other modalities of social justice which you would more likely find in the post-92s. So I think there's a lot of bullshit is too kind. I think two things are going on. One, maybe they don't like their kids, or they seriously, or they don't want their kids to know what they thought and did, right? They want to discipline their kids, something like that, and so it's all about their kids. That's what I think it is. It's all about their kids. And they don't want them hanging around with other kinds of kids. So they're fine. You know, like how many, like Perry Anderson, man. Come on, he's got money. You know what I mean? He was fine as a Marxist. Do you get what I'm saying? The upper class are fine with Marxism, with decolonising, with queer theory. They're fine with it, as long as it doesn't have any justice mandate in it. And I think that's what they're doing with this whole thing at the moment. So I think you're right.